Alright, so we've been talking a lot about like sine and cosine and tangent. And today we're really just focusing on sine and cosine. We're going to look at the graphs of sine and cosine, and we're going to talk about what they look like. Whenever we've done problems before, we always talk about how you solve them, what they mean, and we also look at their graphs. And so today we're just looking at the graphs, and we need to talk about that. So first of all, this is the form of the sine or cosine function that you'll see. Sometimes b is not factored out right here, and that does make that a little bit more difficult whenever we talk about the problems, but I just wanted to let you know that. So first of all, the first vocabulary word we have here is called amplitude. Amplitude is the distance between the max, well, actually this is going to be midline right here, midline and the max or the min. That says midline. If A is negative, the graph flips over, but the amplitude is always positive. And once I show you the graphs, I think the vocabulary will make a little bit more sense. The next word, I know that there is a hole through some of that, but that is midline. So that says midline. And the midline has to do with the D, or the number that's on the end of sine and cosine. It's a horizontal line in the middle of the graph. And it's halfway between the max and the min. It also represents the vertical shift of the graph. So whatever this graph's going to look like, which I'll show you in a minute, there's the middle of it. There's going to be a max and there's going to be a min. And then the middle is the midline. And the distance from the midline to the max, or the midline to the min, that's the amplitude. And it basically just represents moving it up and down. Okay, another vocabulary word here is period. There's nothing to fill in. But the period is represented by 2 pi over b. And b is this number that's here. Whether it's factored out or not, it's the number or coefficient of x. And what it represents is the number of radians it takes to make a complete cycle. So when you talk about sine and cosine, both sine and cosine are graphs that repeat themselves. Okay? When we talked about quadratics, it was a u. It never repeated, it was always a u. Okay? When we talked about absolute value, it was a v. It was always a v, it never changed. Okay? With sine and cosine, it's a curve, and it just keeps going back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and it does the same thing the whole time. Okay? And so a period is the part of it before it starts repeating again. Okay? And I think you'll see that once we look at the graphs. The way you figured out if the question says what is the period is you do 2 pi divided by b, which is that number there. Okay? C represents the horizontal phase shift, which is moving the graph left and right. We won't be dealing with that much, but I wanted to just mention that that's what C represents. So A represents the amplitude. B is the number that will help us to figure out what the period is. C moves the graph right and left. D represents the midline. It also moves the graph up and down. Okay? Sine functions start at the x-axis. And cosine functions start I'm going to put at y equals 1 or y equals negative 1. Basically, I'll show you what that means here in just a second. Now, you can graph these things in Desmos, and we will graph these in Desmos, but before we do that, I wanted to show you the general idea of it and explain what it looks like. So, first of all, the amplitude is the A, or the number in front of sine or cosine. So the amplitude of sine is 1, because there's not a number there. Okay, the period is always 2 pi divided by b. There's an understood 1 right here. So it's 2 pi divided by 1, which just is 2 pi. The midline is like whatever would be right here. It's just like a plus 0, so the midline is 0, which ends up actually being the x-axis. I'll write that there just in case we need it. Okay? We're going to graph it, and then we'll come back and talk about the domain and range. Okay? Now, when we graph, like I said, you can use Desmos, but I just want to show you really like the general whole idea so you have an idea. Sine of x is going to start at the x-axis. So it starts here at 0, 0. And what happens is it goes up, and then comes down, and then goes back up again, and then it repeats. Okay? We're going to put a 2 pi here because 2 pi is the period. And there's like, you see how it's divided into 4 parts? There's 4 parts of each graph. Okay? And that's because it comes up, and then comes down, and then keeps coming down, and then comes back up. And each of those is one part of it. I will tell you that the normal way that you write this is to include all of these pi's. And like if you think about it, this is 1/2 pi, 1 pi, 3/2 pi, and 2 pi. You can always use Desmos to figure that out if you need it. But I just want to show you the general idea. So the sine graph is going to start here. It's going to go up to 1. It's going to come back to the x-axis. It's going to come down to -1 and back to the x-axis. Now, that's the general idea of the way the sine graph looks. What I haven't shown you, though, is that this graph repeats. It just keeps coming. So it's going to come back up and down again. Over here, it's going to come down, and then it's going to come back up. So the graph is going to repeat. I just drew one period of it. Okay? And one period of it is the important part because it explains what all of the graph does. All right, the domain for this graph, because it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth, is all real numbers. The range for this graph, if you think about it, how far down does it go? Well, it goes down to -1. How far up does it go? It goes up to +1. So the range of this graph would be -1 to 1. Sometimes the question might ask you, what is the max or what is the min? Okay, and I'm going to write that down. The max is 1 and the min is -1 because it's like where the highest value is or where the lowest value is. And if we know the amplitude tells us how to figure that out. Okay. Now, very quickly, let me just show you that you can graph this in Desmos. Sine of x. Notice it looks really strange here. At this point in time, this is where radians are important because when we graph these, you do need to be in radians. So you go to that wrench and go to radians, and then it will graph it for us. And then, let's see, let's make that a little bigger. I made it smaller. I didn't mean to. Like I can see that it starts at 0 up here. It's at pi/2 at pi. And notice they didn't just give me decimals, which is nice. If it's regular pi's, they'll give it to me that way. So see, I could draw it on Desmos. That's perfectly fine. I just want you to see what it looks like without Desmos. Okay? All right, let's talk about cosine. And this way we can see what the differences between sine and cosine are. Okay? I will tell you that several of these things are the same. The period is still 2 pi. The amplitude is still 1. The midline is still 0. And now let's talk about what the graph looks like. Okay? It's still going to be labeled the same way with a 2 pi, a pi/2, and a 3 pi/2. But instead of starting at 0 and coming up, it's going to start at 1 or -1. And because it's positive, it's going to start up here at 1. So it does not start on the x-axis like sine does. Okay? So it starts up here, and then it comes down to 0, down to -1, back to 0, and then back to 1. Okay? And so that's what that graph looks like. And technically that graph continues as well. We just drew one period of it. Okay? So the graph of cosine and the graph of sine are really, really similar. It's just that sine starts at 0 and cosine doesn't. Okay? The domain would still be all real numbers. And the range would still be -1 to 1. Because it still goes from 1 to -1. It just looks a little different. If I graph sine and cosine together, you'll see that they're really just shifted of each other. The two graphs are very, very similar. It's just that one graph is shifted a little bit to the right. Okay? Alright, let's talk about a couple more that's not as basic. And let's talk about the period and the amplitude and everything, and then we'll talk about graphing it. Okay? So, on the first one, bigger here. The amplitude is really easy. The amplitude is always the number at the beginning. Okay, so the amplitude here is 3. The period is always 2 pi divided by whatever the coefficient of x is. So in front of x is a 2, so it's going to be 2 pi divided by 2. Sometimes the question will just say, what's the period? What's the amplitude? Okay. The midline is the number if it's moved up or down. This one is moved up 1. It might just say, is it moved up 1 or down or whatever. You would say up 1. If it says what's the midline, you say 1. Okay? The domain will always be all real numbers. And then I'll show you the range once we graph it. Okay? Remember, you can graph it in Desmos, but I want to graph it by hand just so that you have the idea of it. What you do first is you always start at the midline. Okay? The midline is at 1, and I'm going to draw a horizontal dotted line at 1, because what that means is that's the middle of the graph now. The middle of the graph is not the x-axis anymore. The middle of the graph is the midline, which is at 1. Okay, the period is pi, so I know that pi is going to be all the way out to here. So I know that I'm going to draw one whole thing of sine from 0 to pi. Okay. The amplitude is 3. So what that means is that the graph is going to go from the midline, it's going to go up 3. So this is as high as it's going to go. And then from the midline, it's going to go down 3. So this is as low as it's going to go. Okay? If you add the midline and the amplitude, that tells you the biggest value. If you take the midline and subtract the amplitude, it gives you the lowest value. So the midline plus the amplitude means the highest value is going to be 4. And then the midline minus the amplitude is -2. That gives you the min. Okay? But you could graph it to see that. I just want you to see where it comes from. Alright, last important part. Sine of x is the graph that we're looking at, and we know that sine of x always starts at 0. 0 is the midline, so we're going to start at the midline. Okay? We don't just go up to 1 this time, we go all the way up to our biggest value, and then back to the midline, all the way down to our lowest value, and then back to the midline. So the midline is just like the new x-axis, pretty much. Okay? Now, as long as you remember to be into radians, I can graph it. I can find the maximum is 4. I can find the minimum is -2. I could see it starts at 1, so that's the midline. And if I could figure out where it was at 1, I might could figure out what the period was. But really, the period, you just do 2 pi divided by the coefficient. But there's the graph. The graph you can get from Desmos if you want to. Okay, we've got one more that we want to graph. All right. First of all, amplitude is easy. Amplitude is the number in front of cosine. So amplitude is 2. The period is always 2 pi divided by whatever the coefficient of x is. So what am I going to divide by? Pi. Now, when you divide this, you can just think about, canceling and getting rid of things. And so our period is 2. Midline is the middle of the graph. It's how much you move up and down. So the midline would be -1. And then we'll find domain and range again in a minute. I think I forgot to tell you how to find the range over here. We found the min and the max. That represented the range. If you find the min and the max, that tells you what the range is. Okay. So, when we're going to draw it, you start off by drawing that horizontal dotted line at the midline at -1. Okay? We know our period is 2, so I know this is going to be all the way out to 2 here. We know our amplitude is 2. So from the midline, I'm going to go up 2. And from the midline, I'm going to go down 2. So my graph is going to go from here to here, which means it's going to go from -3 to 1. And -3 is the min, and 1 is the max. The domain will still be all real numbers, so nothing changes there. Alright, when we have cosine, we don't start on the midline. We start above the midline, as long as it's positive. So we're going to start up here at our max. We're going to go to the midline, down here, back to the midline, and back up. And then there's one period of it, and that's the idea. Alright, so here's some examples, and it does tell us to graph it, but I'm just going to graph it in Desmos. We're not going to graph anymore by hand. I just wanted you to see those. But I do want to talk about the amplitude and the period and the midline, because those are easy just to get from the equation without graphing. Okay? Amplitude, period, and I'm going to put mid for midline. Okay? Because M could represent max or min, but I'll put mid to help me remember it's not max and min. Okay? Amplitude is the number at the beginning, so amplitude's the 2. Period is always 2 pi divided by whatever's in front of x. Whenever I do this, I don't ever put 2 pi divided by 2 in Desmos. Okay, if there's just 1 pi, I leave the pi and just divide the numbers. So I would do 2 divided by 2, which is 1. And then there's a pi there, so pi is the period. If you put it in Desmos, you'll get a decimal. Decimals are okay as long as you can use that to figure out your answer for multiple choice. Midline is the number at the end, which is -5. Let's do one more, and then I'm going to let you try some. So let's do number 3. Amplitude is the number at the beginning. Amplitude is a half. The period is always 2 pi divided by whatever's in front of x, which is a 1/3. That one's a little bit tricky. If I were going to do 2 pi divided by 1/3, what I would do is I would do 2 divided by and put 1/3 in parentheses like that. I'd get 6. And then so that this means that this represents 6 pi. And then the midline, is the number at the end. If there is one, it's the amount you move up and down. So the midline is at 1. So amplitude is always positive. So if there's a negative at the beginning, that just means you just get rid of that negative. Absolute value, amplitude is always absolute value of that number. So it's always positive because it's a length, it's a distance. Alright, your period is 2 pi divided by whatever's in front of x, which is 3. There's nothing to reduce there, so you just leave it as 2 pi divided by 3. That's it. And then your midline is 2, because that's the number of moving it up or down. If the question said, how much do you move it up or down? That's the same answer as if it said, what would be the midline? Okay, moving it up and down and the midline are the same thing. Alright, number 4. Amplitude is just 1/3. It's the number at the beginning. The period is the one that's kind of tricky here, but it's 2 pi divided by pi over 2. When you have pi's in the answer in both parts, you could put that whole thing in Desmos like that. Or you could just get rid of the pi's and then put 2 divided by 1/2. The only reason I wouldn't put the pi in there is if there's only one. But if you wanted to put it, you could. And right down here is where that pi is. So if you wanted to put it in there like that, you could. The only time that I don't recommend that is if there's only one pi. But anyway, you're going to get 4 for the period. And then the midline is -3. Okay, any questions? Alright. The last part of the lesson that we want to do is we want to look at some graphs and we want to talk about what the equation of them would be. Again, you can use Desmos, especially if it's multiple choice. If you've got 4 choices and all you need to do is put in those choices and see which one matches up, you can do that. Okay? I do want to talk about it a little bit so that I can just talk about what the amplitude looks like, what the period looks like, and so on. So, on this graph right here, first thing I would do is I would figure out, okay, where's the middle of the graph? Because the middle of the graph helps me find everything else that I need to find. Okay, the middle of the graph is at the x-axis. And you can just look at like the max and the min and see what's in the middle of it. Okay? What that tells me is that the midline is 0. Because that's the middle. And that's the first thing I look at. After I find the middle, then I'm going to find the amplitude. And the amplitude, if you think about the middle, the amplitude is how far from the middle it goes up. So how far from the middle does that graph go up? 3. So amplitude is 3. You can also go from the middle to down. It should still be the same. Alright, here's the period. The period's a little bit tricky because you have to like capture one part of the graph. Okay? So if I start the graph at 0, I'm going to draw it until I get back to where it starts. Oh, it starts right there. That's one whole period, the orange is. So what's the period? I started at 0, where did I end? So 2 pi is the period. Is this graph a sine or a cosine graph? It's a sine graph, and you know that because it started at the midline. If it started above the midline, it would not be sine. Okay, but starting at the midline means it's sine. Okay, so amplitude is 3, so 3 goes at the beginning. And then we know it's sine. Okay, the number that goes here. You know how you always do 2 pi divided by b? The same thing happens to get b. To figure out what number goes there, you do 2 pi divided by the period. Okay, to get b, it's 2 pi divided by the period. So the period is 2 pi divided by b. The b is 2 pi divided by the period. You always divide by 2 pi to get the other thing. And so it is just going to be a 1 right there. That's the x always goes beside the the B or the period. And then midline goes at the end. Okay? You don't have to put the 1 there. You can just leave it as an X. If you wanted to check, did I do that right? You could do it like that, and then look at the graph and see if important points match up. And it looks like it does. Okay. We'll skip down to 3 for a second, and then we'll come back to some of these others. First thing I want to do is draw the middle of the graph. The middle of the graph here is still at the x-axis because I can see it goes up to 3 and it goes down to 3. Okay? That means the midline is 0. It also means that the amplitude is still 3. Interestingly enough, on this graph, they drew just one period of it. The graph continues to go, but they drew one period of it. What is the period here? It's like wherever it ends, where you like start it and go all the way to the end. Pi. Does that make sense? So pi is the period. To get b, I'm going to do 2 pi divided by pi. Pi's will go away, so I get 2. Alright, is this graph going to be sine or is this graph going to be cosine? Cosine. Because it doesn't start at 0, it starts up here. If it starts somewhere else other than 0, it's not sine. Okay? So let's write out what we know. We've got 3 cosine b, x always goes beside the b, and then our midline's at the end, plus 0. You don't have to have the plus 0, but if it helps you to make sure you have all the things there, then go ahead and do it. Alright, so these other two, the midline is not in the middle at the x-axis like these last ones were. So what we do to figure it out is we think about, okay, we're up here at 5. That's how high we go. And how low we go is at -1. So I'm trying to figure out what value is in between 5 and -1. Okay? You can kind of count it if you want to, or you could just say 5 plus -1 and then divide it by 2. Okay? You could add the top and the bottom together and divide by 2. That tells you where the middle is. If you weren't sure and that didn't make sense, really you could just count it. Go up 1, go down 1. Go up another 1, go down 1. Go up another 1 and down 1. Oh, I meet there at 2. 2 has to be the middle. Okay? So the middle is at 2. Okay, the amplitude is how much it is from the middle. So the middle's at 2. How much up did it go from the middle? It went from 2 to 5, so it went 3. Okay, let's talk about the period. The period is the one I think that's most complicated. Okay, and I'm just going to, when I do it, I always just kind of draw it. So I start it like at the beginning, and I'll draw it until I get to back where I started. I got back to where I started there. That was at 4. So 4 is the period. Which means b is 2 pi divided by 4. You can reduce the 2 and the 4 and get 1/2. And that's everything we need. This graph is cosine because it starts up there. So it's amplitude, cosine, b. Oh, I shouldn't have wrote b. Shouldn't have written b, so I put pi over 2, I'm sorry. X, and then the midline. And that formula is on the other side of this paper, or it's A, sine or cosine, B, and then midline. That's like the order that everything goes in, if that helps. But that's on the other side of the paper too. Okay, let's do one more. Okay, let's think about it here. Our highest value is 5. Our lowest value is 1. So add it and divide by 2 if you want to, or just think about what's in the middle of 5 and 1. 3. So 3 is the midline. Okay. How far from the midline do we go up? 2. Good. Okay, the period, I start it, keep going till I get back. The period is 2 pi. So B is 2 pi divided by 2 pi. That's the same thing over the same thing, so I get 1. That's nice. Is this sine or cosine? Sine because it started at 0. So amplitude sine Bx plus 3.